And welcome back to the Japan Politics Podcast. I'm your host, Luke Whittaker, and this is the show where we talk about all things relating to Japanese politics in English. And I'd like to start off this week by talking about rumblings of who the potential successor to Prime Minister Ishiba could be. And I expect this story to sort of rumble on and continue post the gift scandal, and given that Ishiba's in a minority government up until July, when we have the upper house elections in Japan, which are likely... it's projected to be quite bad for the LDP, and that could be a very difficult position for Ishiba to carry on from. But before we get ahead of ourselves, the first potential successor that's been in the news as being under discussion is the leader of the DPFP, of all people, Tamaki. Now, why is this in the news? He's entirely separate. He's an opposition party. How could he be the next Prime Minister of Japan when the LDP are in office, even though they're a minority government? Well, effectively, it's been reported that people within the LDP have been discussing this and the possibility of it, which is quite dramatic. Maybe it's just idle talk, I don't know. But it would be quite staggering to do that ahead of an election, to oust Ishiba and then hand over power to an entirely separate party and effectively let the DPFP take the reins. They'd probably have to make all sorts of concessions to them in order for them to agree to that. It's quite risky for the DPFP as well, but obviously tantalising prospect for them to have their own leader as Prime Minister, to get their hands on the reins of power. And of course, while the LDP is a minority government, if they were to get the DPFP in, that would very much secure a majority, and they would be able to operate for the next few years before there was an election, get legislation through, and it would add a bit of security. So you can see why they're talking about it. There are risks, of course. The risks are the DPFP leader. Obviously, he's not there from their party, so if he does very well, and I believe he has like a bit of a social media presence, Tamaki, he's got some charisma, and if he's able to, and of course he had a very successful election, he increased the seats of the DPFP. So if he's able to carry on with that winning run and be very good, that could very much take away from the fact that the majority of the government would be LDP seats, and it would put all the attention on him, and people would likely credit it if he came in as Prime Minister and suddenly things started going very well. They would credit him for the success, and rather than the LDP. So it's got serious success. That's even if things go well, it's got risk for the LDP. Obviously, they could oust their leader, put the opposition party in charge, and then if things go badly, they'll get blamed for it, both for having put him in charge and for being very much involved in the government. So there's clear risk there. Also, he has gone through scandal, Tamaki, although, as I say, he has had this big electoral success recently. He was exposed in, I think, an extramarital affair scandal, and he had to temporarily resign leadership of the party relatively recently. So although Ishiba has a sort of scandal history with the gift scandal, it wouldn't be an entirely fresh start from scandal unless, they think, it's put behind him, this is a risk we have to take. The pros are very obvious. It would end this rumbling speculation over Ishiba's future, and it would secure like a majority for the next few years, and maybe they can think we can just hunker down, get some legislation through, and if it's successful, we can claim credit along with the DPFP. But yeah, it's pretty dramatic that they would consider something like that. Now, another thing to consider is that Tamaki, of course, as the leader of the DPFP, he's had recent electoral success, as I said, and if the LDP continues to decline and they opt not to attempt this sort of manoeuvre of bringing the DPFP into a coalition with them and making Tamaki the Prime Minister of a LDP-DPFP coalition, then we might see him possibly return as Prime Minister anyway, because if the LDP continue to decline, as they have done from these scandals, and they have been reduced to minority government, in the next election, if they were to decline a bit further, it's very likely that if they were to be succeeded, it would be from a coalition rather than an outright replacer. And so you could see possibly the DPFP return in a coalition to replace them, with possibly even DPFP leader Tamaki at the head of it. It's incredibly speculative, but something to consider, that he might be returning as Prime Minister in either case. Also, there's been some discussion, of course, about Sanae Takaichi. Now, she finished, we talked about her a few times on the show, she finished second to Ishiba, came very close to becoming prime minister instead of him. And of course, naturally, people are going to, when Ishiba's struggling, look to her as the potential, waiting in the wings figure. And there's been, the reason I bring this up again is because there's been a couple of opinion polls which have suggested that although when first this story about the gift scandal was reported, there were a number of candidates floated that might step in from the LDP and become the next prime minister. Now she's had a couple of quite favourable polls, I think. The first put her on 40.8%, which is a very good number. 40.8% of people would prefer her as the next prime minister, according to one survey. And the second place was from within the LDP, Shinjiro, and he was down on 5.1%. So that's quite a dramatic drop off in that one poll. Also, a separate poll reported that 90% of people were disappointed with Ishiba, which is quite high, and around 30% would support Takaichi as their first choice. Now, obviously, you'd want that number to be higher. 90% of people are disappointed with Ishiba, and, you'd want more than 30% of those people to want you to replace him. But nonetheless, she's come out ahead, and 30%, is a large segment of the population, at least according to this one poll. So, yeah, it's very interesting that that's floating around, and you have to wonder if that's sort of influencing her opinion to hear things like this, because it would be up to her probably to sort of gather support and put in a leadership challenge unless Ishiba's going to resign, or if the opposition call a vote of no confidence, which they could if they were all to unite effectively to oust him. But perhaps she might bide her time and just say, oh, okay, I'm in a favourable position now, I'll wait to see what happens in July. But yeah, this sort of talk, I think, is going to, and speculation is going to rumble on for a while, so we'll just have to wait and see with that one. Despite this, Ishiba hasn't been idle. He's been on effectively a sort of world tour. He's been to visit the Vietnam and the Philippines, and he's had talks, and now this probably very much plays into something that Ishiba wants to do. It's nice for him as a new prime minister, relatively after the election, fresh in the job, to be able to have these nice photo ops and act statesman-like. And as more time goes on from the gift scandal, hopefully he'll be able to distance it if he can get, nice photo ops, him meeting with world leaders looking statesman-like. It's all very positive for him. And he's also had the spectre of these tariffs from Trump, so perhaps he can maybe be seen as taking a lead on this and sort of discussing that with Asian leaders. And also Ishiba has in the past talked about his idea of having an Asian NATO, so having a separate NATO within Asia to sort of have collective security. And he seems very keen on that idea, or he's muted it in the past. So possibly he very much likes this sort of thing, and he can forging closer ties with other Asian leaders. This could also represent sort of a competition for influence. China is going to be very much looking to gain influence with nations like the Philippines and Vietnam. They're doing things like looking to spread their influence, have military bases in different countries, have security agreements, and they're also, in many respects, with Trump instituting these tariff wars, China are kind of positioning themselves as like a rival house to the USA, and saying, well, why not come to agreements with us instead? Is a path they could be taking, and at the very least they're rivaling the USA in all these tariff wars and tariff talks. But it appears that Japan is having to also compete for influence with different Asian neighbours and countries, and so he's getting out there and having these discussions, having these agreements, and he has had some early success. Like I say, he's got the big photo op with in the Philippines and Vietnam, and it appeared there's been some early success, in particular with the Philippines, where there's been discussions of a security pact, which, as I say, feeds very much into this Asian NATO idea that Ishiba likely likes very much. And there's been some early breakthroughs on that, and it looks like there's going to be discussions on the possibility of a security pact. Now, it's interesting that Ishiba has gone to these visits now rather than remaining home and focusing all his efforts on the tariff talks, or alternatively putting more effort into upcoming talks with China. But I suppose you could argue maybe he sees this as a little bit more manageable. Like if he was to go to China right now, for instance, that could be seen as sort of defying Trump. It's very hot button to sort of go over and have talks with China when Japan's still effectively negotiating with Trump and trying to get a favourable tariff deal and avoid the possibility of these tariffs going on for longer or increasing. And also, maybe it sort of strengthens his hand if he's seen as aligning himself more closely with other nations, getting agreements through, and so perhaps it's a nice, effectively a distraction to something for him to do first before he focuses on those two big issues. But yeah, it looks like that tour, at least optically, has gone relatively successfully. So that's a nice win for Ishiba. At the very least, he's got those photo ops and that PR moment. So that's a good win for him, really, I think. The next story I'd like to talk about is something I've discussed before, but I think is going to, again, like the speculation about Ishiba, is likely to rumble on possibly. And that's there's been reports that perhaps Komeito are a little bit unhappy with their situation, being in so closely aligned to the LDP as they're becoming unpopular. They've been in coalition with them as a minority partner for some time now. And there's rumblings that some people within Komeito are a little bit unhappy at the moment. The reason that's come up again, and that's particularly focused, is, as I say, we're marching towards these July elections, and Komeito have officially endorsed free House of Council candidates within the LDP, and these are people who are implicated in the slush fund scandal, and that's something that really damaged the credibility and the popularity of the LDP. But these members are still within the party and they're still running for election. And Komeito, as the minority coalition partner of the LDP, has, I suppose, felt they had to endorse them officially. But some within the Komeito are reported as being members and supporters are reported as being a little bit unhappy about that. I suppose maybe they see themselves as being hurt by implication of that scandal. Maybe they feel they're too closely aligned with the LDP at a time when they're sort of losing popularity, and they're sort of aligning themselves too closely with them. Maybe they should be more independent and have more of their own distinct partnership. As I say, as I've discussed previously, the Komeito leader even lost his seat as a result of his close association with the LDP in the previous election, or at least you could argue that was a key factor, was their coalition with the LDP was behind him losing his seat. So they've already suffered to some extent. They didn't have a particularly good previous election, and now they're going into the July election, and perhaps being a house divided if some members and supporters are unhappy at this. There's also a recent comparison. I've talked before about how often minority partners in a coalition suffer a little bit. You've recently seen this happen in Canada, where Mark Carney just won the election, despite Trudeau, his predecessor, being very unpopular. He managed to rally things around, which is perhaps encouraging for the LDP, as an example. But he, within a relatively short space of time, managed to rally things around and win a term for himself. But the NDP, a party who were in coalition with Trudeau during his time in government, they, I believe, lost quite a few seats and suffered badly in the election. Despite the fact that the Liberal Party has, I said, stayed on under Carney, the NDP has really been left behind and suffered a big loss in seats. And it's also interesting because the NDP is a sort of, I think, more left-aligned compared to the Liberal Party. Now, you could perhaps make that argument of Komeito. They're sort of a Buddhist, sort of humanist party, whereas the LDP are sort of conservative. So you could maybe make the subjective argument that Komeito are more liberal than the LDP. Now, you could see that as like a warning sign. Obviously, Canadian politics and Japanese politics do not perfectly align at all, but that's another example of like a minor coalition partner suffering an election. So maybe that's a little bit of a warning sign recently for Komeito. But as I say, there's rumblings of some members and supporters being a little bit unhappy at the direction of travel. So that's something to keep an eye on as we go into July, and we'll have to see how Komeito do as well as the LDP. That rounds up the political news, but now I'd like to focus on a sort of a more light relief news. Well, in a way, it has serious consequences, though, which is the fact that a snake has caused a power outage on a Japanese train. Now, we heard recently about the power outages in Spain and Portugal. They were very serious, cut internet power throughout the country and left a number of people stranded, and it sort of is a story about the reliance on electronics in modern society and how unprepared people are arguably to go back to low tech. And there's a similar story on a sort of a lower level here, which is that a meter-long snake apparently wrapped itself around like a power line and brought like a busy train to a standstill, effectively stopped trains within Japan. And this was between Tokyo and Osaka. The Shinkansen trains were brought to a standstill because of this snake. And it's just remarkable, really. I mean, there's a story about just how fragile modern life is, and nature versus the designs of man. But I just thought it was incredible that a single snake was able to do this and just effectively affect so many people's lives, cause such chaos, and bring an outage onto Japan. So yeah, pretty remarkable. And this happened, I believe, around 5:25, so really peak sort of going home commuter time, and ran around till 7. So you can just imagine the amount of disruption, chaos, confusion. And Japan, of course, notoriously known for its very reliable trains, but apparently brought completely to a halt by this snake, which is pretty remarkable. So yeah, just a little bit more of a light read story there. But yeah, thank you so much for listening, guys. This has been the Japan Politics Podcast. I'm your host, Luke Whittaker. Thank you so much for listening. Sayonara, goodbye.